Welcome to Proverbs. Today we're going to study Proverbs chapter 8 and the theme, choose the God of wisdom. Let's look at the context, and then we'll start looking at the content. But the context. In Proverbs 1-7, the godly father taught. Now in Proverbs 8, the God of wisdom teaches. Wisdom is personified as a woman. So you have the ungodly adulteress calling out the sinners in Proverbs 7:26-27. We looked at that just briefly and noted her dialogue in chapter 7:14-20, which results in death. But Lady Wisdom, as she is personified, or the wisdom of God, in Proverbs 8:35, is calling out, inviting, which results in life, the final verse in this chapter. We must choose. So this is the choices that we have been seeing between the lifestyle of foolishness and the lifestyle of wisdom. So let's look at the content. Let's look at the overall content, and this is more of an analytical approach, and then we'll look at the homiletical approach. But analyzing it helps us find the main division. So the introduction is in chapter 8, 1-3, where you have she is inviting. Then you have the body is presented in the first person, I. And then the conclusion in verse 32, now therefore, ends with an exhortation, again, to choose the God of wisdom. So let's use why as the interrogative in this homiletical outline. Why should we choose the God of the wisdom? And the transitional sentence would be because of the following reasons. Number one, because. And so each main division is going to start with because God is inviting, chapter 8, 1-11. Because God is rewarding, verses 12-21. Because God is exemplifying, chapter 8, 22-31. And then God is challenging. That's that conclusion that we looked at. God is inviting. So we go to chapter 8, verse 1. Does not wisdom cry and understand and understanding put forth her voice? So here you have wisdom in the third person, and she is crying out. She is inviting all over this busy city. And you have 4 locations. Verse 2, she stands in the top of the high places, by way of the places of paths or roads. She cries at the gate of this entry of the city. And of course, we know this is where the leaders of the city met and conducted business in those ancient cities. So you see, she is everywhere. She is having influence everywhere in the city. And then in the verse 3, at the coming in at the doors. So here she is. She is inviting. All over the city, she is inviting everyone. So here it gets personal in verse 4. Unto you, O man, I call. So she is personally inviting. And my voice to the sons of men. So you can see third person to first person. This is helping us find subdivisions. But here, again, notice the contrast. In chapter 7, you had a prostitute in the street, a street prostitute inviting sinners. But here, you have a street preacher inviting people to follow her, or to follow wisdom instead of following the wicked woman of wickedness, to the end thereof being death. And she invites and offers. So backing up to verse 5, we see who specifically she is inviting. O ye simple, that's the simpletons, that's the uninitiated youth. Understand wisdom, and you fools, be ye of an understanding heart. That would be the older, those who have progressed in their foolishness. We saw the 3 fools in chapter 1. So 2 of them are invited here, perhaps just saying all these fools, or those who are rejecting wisdom, are invited. And what does she offer? Well, she offers virtues in chapter 8, verse 6. Listen. So here you got a couple of imperatives here that she is giving in verse 6. For I speak of excellence. So Solomon gives 8 adjectives to describe virtue for those who listen and obey. And you can look at them there. And so I read this is from Thomas Constable in his commentary on this. And he said, I like this, wisdom and godliness are practically synonymous. Wisdom and godliness are practically synonymous. And that's the essence of these 8 adjectives here to describe virtue. If you listen and obey, God will give you wisdom to live godly. It reminds me of James 3. James is considered a wisdom book in the New Testament because it emphasizes wisdom. Why are wisdom books in the Old Testament considered wisdom literature? Because they make so much of wisdom. Well, James does that in the New Testament. James 1, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God. But in chapter 3, verse 17, James says, we need wisdom from above, which is first pure and then peaceable. Wisdom from above will make you pure or godly, and then peaceable with people. And so James is sort of following up here with what is taught in Proverbs. So God invites and he offers virtues or godliness and that which is valuable. So here you have another imperative in verse 8. In verse 10, receive. So you see these grammatical clues that are throughout the book, or throughout this unit, I should say, that help us find sometimes the main divisions, sometimes subdivisions. So you have 2 imperatives here. And you have the command in verse 10, receive or take my instruction, and not silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. So what he's saying here is that wisdom is more important than wealth. And then he gives the reason in verse 11, which begins with the word for. That's another key word. For. Wisdom is better than rubies. So here's one of these. This is better than that in Proverbs. There's 21 of these better than verses. I put down Proverbs 15:17 here. I'm just going to turn over there real quick. Proverbs 15:17. Better is a dinner of herbs or vegetables where love is than a stalled ox and hatred thereof. What's he say? It's better to have a vegetable plate, say with your wife or your husband, where there is love, than going to an expensive restaurant like Ruth Chris and eating steak, but you hate one another. Well, here's a better than. Wisdom is better than wealth. He's not going to exclude wealth, because we're in this Old Testament idea of one of the ways that God prospered or blessed the spiritual was with wealth. But God is inviting, as we see. And look at this New Testament verse. For those who want to get rich, want there is greatly desire. It's like the drive of a person's life. What happens to them? Well, they fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. The goal of our life should not be a millionaire or a billionaire. The goal of our life should be to live such a godly life that we bring pleasure to God. So why should we choose the God of wisdom? Because he is inviting and because he is rewarding. So he just keeps coming back to this theme of rewarding. There are two rewards, and each begin with a first person singular pronoun. In Proverbs 8:12, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence. The second one we're going to see in verse 17, I love them. So the first reward is the reward of wisdom. The reward of morality. I, wisdom. Wisdom teaches us what to hate. Verse 13. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Then he specifies what kind of evil: pride, arrogancy, the evil way, the sinful mouth do I hate. So here's that big fear of the Lord theme in Proverbs, and we've seen that it's two parts to it. It recognizes who the Lord is, and then it responds. Well, in this case, we recognize that God is wisdom, and our response is to hate or to choose what displeases God. So you have that basic underlying meaning to the word hate here in Malachi 1:3. Jacob have I loved, and Esau have I hated. It didn't mean God emotionally hated Esau. It just means he chose Jacob for the spiritual heritage. Luke 14, verse 26, Jesus sort of falls in line with this thinking, where he says, if you do not hate your father, your mother, your husband, your wife, your children, you cannot be my disciple. He's not saying hate your wife, because that would contradict Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wife. He's saying choose me over them to be my disciple. And so sometimes, that has to take place. We have to choose to serve God rather than sometimes even our parents. What if God calls a son to be a missionary, and those parents say, well, I want the grandchildren here. I want to see the grandchildren. Well, we have to choose to serve the Lord. And sometimes we don't hate our parents, but we choose to serve him, put him before anyone else. Wisdom gives us the strength to do right in verse 14. Counsel is mine, and sound wisdom. I am understanding, I have strength. So wisdom will not only tells us what to do, but wisdom will give us the strength to do it. Strength to do right in Washington. Of course, I'm applying this. But look, it almost looks like that Solomon is preparing the heir apparent. Look in verse 15. By me kings reign, and princes decree justice. By me princes rule, and nobles, even all the judges of the earth. Wouldn't it be awesome if all three branches of our government, the executive, the judicial, the legislative, were all driven by and possessed the wisdom of God? How much turmoil would there not be in our government today if it was the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of man that is driving all of these controversies? Why should we choose wisdom? Because God is inviting, God is rewarding. He gives the reward of morality, and then he comes and he uses first person I again, and he not only tells us what to hate, but he emphasizes what we should love. Verse 17, I love them that love me. We not only hate evil, but we love the Lord. That's why we hate evil. And so love begins in verse 17, and then you have love again in verse 21, that I may cause those that love me to inherit. So again, you see the repetition here of a word that's going to help us identify a sub-point. The God of wisdom sought us in chapter 8, 1-16. You saw her as the street preacher who is pursuing the fool. But now we seek him. Verse 17, I love them that love me, and those that seek me early shall find me. I like that, seek God early. I don't know when everybody's got best times of the day. I think my best time of the day is in the morning. Some people are nocturnal. But so I think early here doesn't have to be, from 6 on, or however early you get on. It's the best part of the day. It's when we seek him. It's not just a time of day, but it's our whole life. If we seek him, we will find tangible wealth, riches, and intangible righteousness. Chapter 8, verse 18. But wisdom is better. Verse 19, my fruit of wisdom is better than gold. So even in this Old Testament setting where God's blessings were measured more with physical and material, still the spiritual is given the priority. And again, we come back to that big theme. We must choose this path or lifestyle. Verse 20, I lead in the way, the path of righteousness. There's that lifestyle again of following the Lord, having this wisdom. And then we should choose to serve the God of wisdom because he is exemplifying. And here we come to this big verse in chapter 8, verse 22, debatable verse. The Lord possessed me. So who is me? In the beginning. So he is hearkening back to creation here, as we shall see. In the beginning of his way, before his work of old. Here, there are at least 3 views on this. Christ is referred to in Proverbs 8:22 and was created before creation, and me refers to Christ. Okay, we're going to say that as heretical. Another view also sees this as Christ in Proverbs 8:22 as eternally begotten before creation, and me refers to Christ. So this is not heretical. But here, I think is the preferable view. God's eternal attribute of wisdom was possessed. So you got this word quana that can, just like most words, have different meanings in different contexts. And one of the meanings is create, another meaning is to generate, another meaning is to possess. God's eternal attribute of wisdom was possessed before creation. Me refers to the attribute of God, wisdom. So here's the first one. Christ is referred to in Proverbs 8:22 and was created before creation. Me refers to Christ. And this is the way the Septuagint translates this Hebrew word. Of course, this is Arius. Arius, of course, chose this translation, that wisdom here is Christ, and he was created because Arius denied the eternality of Christ. So that's why we just flat out reject that. Derek Kidner discusses that. Here's a second view, held by conservatives. I've mentioned Peter Stevenson. Christ is referred to in Proverbs 8:22 as eternally begotten before creation. Me refers to Christ. So Quanan can mean beget, as it does in Genesis 4:1. Eve begat her son. But Stevenson says this is the eternal generation. So that's a doctrine. It's based on, and it's part of the discussion of the Trinity, and I discuss it here in this article on the ontological Trinity. That is the three persons of the Trinity's relationship to each other versus the Trinity's relationship to creation. And I talk about it right here, eternal generation, if you're interested in looking at that. But it's based on this verse, in part on John 5:26. And I hold to the eternal generation of Christ, but I don't think that's the meaning in Proverbs 8:22, but John 5:26, Jesus speaking, for as the Father has life in himself, so has he given to the Son to have life in himself. In other words, you have this eternal giving of life from the Father to the Son. That's what fathers do with their children or with their sons. But it's eternal. There is no beginning of God the Father giving life to his Son. So here's Peter Stevenson. You can take time to read this, defending that view. That's in his book on Proverbs that I have referenced several times. Excellent commentary. Christ, and then this is Derek Kidner, referring to another author who holds to this view. So you can read those. But here's the view that I think is preferable. God's eternal attribute of wisdom was possessed before creation, and me refers to God's wisdom here. So we know Christ is the revelation of God's nature. Thus, this personification bears striking resemblance to the Savior when we get to the New Testament. Yet, this is John Kitchen's commentary on Proverbs that I have highly recommended. Look what he says. Yet, wisdom, despite the literary use of personification, is something God is, not a being in and of itself. That which is an attribute of God must itself be eternal, since God is a singular being and no attribute stands alone, but is one with all God's other attributes. So I think this is the preferable view, that this is the attribute of God that Solomon is advocating. He's been advocating wisdom versus foolishness. This sort of fits in with the whole theme of Proverbs. Derek Kidner says, elsewhere, quana predominantly means get, hence possess. So you go back just a few chapters to chapter 4, verse 5, for example, get wisdom, that is, possess it. Same thing in verse 7. Here it is the noun form. It's what God possesses as an attribute. So you can read Derek Kidner's view on it. And I think this view is stronger because of the whole context and the whole theme of Proverbs being, get this wisdom. And again, we see Christ is the wisdom of God in the New Testament. Well, he is, because he is God. There's one essence and three persons. They all share deity. The attribute of God, wisdom, predates creation. God possessed wisdom before creation. God used this attribute when he was creating. So you go back and you just see it fits into the context. Chapter 3, verse 19. The Lord by wisdom has founded or created the earth. God did nothing without wisdom. And what is Solomon saying to his son and to us? Neither should we. We need his wisdom. And so what he's going to do next is actually show the 6 days of creation. He's saying God had this attribute of wisdom, and he exercised that wisdom in each day of creation. And you can see how they line up, these following verses, with Genesis 1 and the 6 days of creation. I'm just recommending this book right here. I'm reading it right now, and I'm doing a review of it, coming to grips with Genesis, because this is written by conservative scholars. I mean, conservative scholars, and they hold to 6 24-hour days of creation and a approximately 6,000 year old planet. Now, of course, that's fallen out of favor because of the influence of atheistic evolution, but they base it on the genealogy of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, which has no gaps. Now, you have genealogies that do have gaps, but they argue because you have a time stamp when the father gave birth to the son grew up, gave time stamps it with his age when he gave birth to his son. So you can read it if you're interested in looking at this conservative defense of a young earth versus an old earth point of view. So let's look at this. Proverbs 8:23. With his wisdom, with the attribute of wisdom, I was set, verse 22. Let's back up to verse 22. The Lord possessed me in the beginning. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So you see that creation atmosphere here or context. And in verse 23, you have the first day. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever was the earth. Wisdom is eternal because wisdom is an attribute of the eternal God. This is called the doctrine of simplicity, where all the attributes of God equal his essence. God is indivisible. And so here you have God using his wisdom to create, but he's using his omnipotence also to bring it into existence. So this is the doctrine of simplicity. So if you're interested, I talk about this again. This doctrine is related to the Trinity. Matthew Barrett has a really good book on this, on the Trinity. But he talks about the doctrine of simplicity, and he describes it for us right here. Simplicity is another doctrine that emphasizes the oneness of deity of the three persons of the Trinity. Simplicity means that God's essence just is his attributes. All his attributes equal his essence. So if you're interested in looking at that, and there's a good book there written by Matthew Barrett on the Trinity. So this is Kitchen right here. This is Kitchen talking about the doctrine of simplicity in regard to creation. Day 2, Proverbs 8:24. You have the separation of waters. Wisdom was brought forth functionally here, not ontologically, because wisdom is the function of our wise God. Then you have day 3 with the appearance of land. Day 4, the creation of planets. Day 5, marine life. And then day 6, creation of man. Verse 31. Rejoicing in the habitable part of his earth, and my delights were with the sons of men. So again, this is Hebrew poetry. This is the poetic version of Genesis 1. And so at the end, he refers to the sons of men, that God is rejoicing in the crown of his creation, which was man, made in his image, man and woman. Of all the creation, only man and woman made in the image of God. God is inviting, God is rewarding, God is exemplifying. We should choose this God. And because God is challenging, so now he brings all this to a conclusion. Now, therefore, hearken. So you have two exhortations, two imperatives. So he's coming down to the conclusion. And he says in verse 32, hearken. Verse 33, hear. And then he follows with two benedictions or blessings. That if you obey, if you respond to these imperatives, you're going to be blessed. In verse 32, blessed are they that keep my words. Verse 34, blessed is the man that hears me, watches daily at my gates, waiting at the post of my doors. He doesn't go into the house of the prostitute in Proverbs 7, where she invites and lures him. No, he goes into the house of wisdom. He gains wisdom by having this fellowship with God. But there's two consequences. Verse 35, verse 36, there's a consequence of life. If you follow wisdom, if you live this lifestyle, follow this path. Verse 35, for whosoever finds me finds life and shall obtain favor of the Lord. But, here's that big contrast, he that sins against me wrongs his own soul, and all they that hate me love death. So, I have this post here on the culture of death. Listen to Kent Hughes. This is in a pastoral theology book. Kent Hughes reminds us that we live in the culture of death. We play violent video games. We watch documentaries on serial killers. We murder our unborn. We live in a culture of death. And I referred to what happened a few years back in North Carolina when the General Assembly passed a 12-week abortion ban. In other words, after 12 weeks, there can be no abortion. We wish the ban was after conception, but this was at least an advance. Roy Cooper, the governor at that point, had a big rally to veto it. But the General Assembly overran his veto. That's a culture of death that we live in. One senator said, the lives of millions of unborn children will be saved. And so we thank God for that. But this is another culture of death here. This is a culture of eternal death, eternal separation from God, and eternal life when we choose to receive Christ as our Savior and follow God in his wisdom who is offering it. So this is a great passage, great study, and a great exhortation to choose the God of wisdom.